Composition training used to be exclusively the domain of conservatories. In the 20th century, a lot of it migrated to universities. Unfortunately, in some cases, the change to a more academic framework has worked to the detriment of really professional training. One of the good things about doing my own doctorate in composition at Juilliard was the fact that the requirements for composition were very demanding, but there was no academic side. No essays to write, theses to defend, theories to propound, and so on. One just had to write a lot of good, well-crafted music. One particularly problematic aspect of university training is that, to make place for all the academic requirements, the craft side of composition often gets reduced. So, for example, instead of doing 2 years of counterpoint with hundreds of exercises, the student does 1 or 2 exercises of each type. This is like trying to learn a language with 5 minutes of practice per week. It's impossible. Even when the teaching was not the best, in a conservatory at least, the sheer quantity of the exercises helped the student to make friends with the notes, becoming familiar with all kinds of possibilities just by trying them out. When working on craftsmanship, quantity matters. However, even in the conservatories, there was a lot of variability in the level of instruction. The less effective teachers are the ones who just promulgated a bunch of rules, namely telling the students what not to do. This is not a good way to teach. Nobody loves a piece of music for what it doesn't do. It's essential to understand that these rules fall into 2 categories. There are practical rules like the range of the viola, which simply aren't negotiable. You can't tune the lowest string down to F sharp. The other kinds of rules are either a result of sensible pedagogy, like deliberately focusing on one problem at a time, or else they point to common mistakes made by beginners. But in both cases, they're not God-given commands to be followed at all costs. In species counterpoint, for example, each species focuses on one rhythm, simply to be able to concentrate on one thing at a time. However, once that stage has been passed, this kind of exercise isn't relevant anymore. As for the rules about common problems, they will eventually require a lot of qualification. For example, parallel fifths and first species in 2 parts are very salient and create audible holes in the texture. But in a fugue in 4 parts, where the lines are rhythmically independent and one of the parts includes a suspension, parallel fifths 3 notes apart are usually inaudible. And that should really be the final criterion. What do we hear? Further, the teacher should be able to explain why, in situations like the latter example, we don't notice them. This helps to refine students' oral judgment, and that should be a prime goal of good teaching. What is salient and most easily audible isn't random. It follows principles of perception basic to the human mind. Rightly understood, these principles apply to all music. They aren't style-dependent, but they're always related to context. What works in one context might not work at all in another. Part of the teacher's job is to make the context clear. The student understands what sounds normal in that situation. In studying harmony, as in counterpoint, the numerous rules about what is forbidden are only for beginners. Anybody who does a lot of harmony exercises will soon come across situations that are forbidden, but which sound just fine. Again, the teacher's job is to explain why one situation sounds better than another in relation to how human perception works. This is very context dependent. Again, parallel fifths in a classical 2-part texture create a hole. They sound empty. Place a third in the middle of one of those Debussy passages in parallel fifths, and it will sound just as out of place. Again, part of the teacher's job is to help the student write consistently in whatever style they're aiming at. A great deal of music's power comes from the way it takes characteristic patterns in sound and then develops them in interesting ways, creating expectations and playing with them. This is fundamental to engaging the listener with the music. A pattern that is too simple is boring, but a pattern that sounds random also quickly becomes uninteresting. Playing with patterns in ways that combine expectations and surprise is a big part of the composer's job. But that requires consistent context. So, consistency of context should be a major requirement when teaching music. If my more advanced counterpoint students have enough background in harmony, I often let them use 7th chords in species counterpoint. But once you do use 7th chords in species counterpoint, they need to be used consistently and in the right way. This kind of consistency is also an essential criterion for a student's own composition. Another point not often mentioned in harmony and counterpoint teaching is that when something happens is just as important as what. A strong dissonance that would sound like a mistake in measure 3 might be perfect for the climax of the phrase. Again, the teacher's job is always to explain these things in relation to the overall context. While we usually teach harmony using tonal music, if it's explained correctly, many of these deeper perception-based principles can be transferred to other styles. I discuss general principles harmony in an online video. See the link below. When we look at harmony in this way, most problems can be seen as either bumps or holes. A bump is an accent at a point where it seems irrelevant. A hole is a moment where the music sounds empty, too static, and this approach can be applied to any coherent musical style. Orchestration is, of course, essential for a composer. The first step is just learning what's idiomatic for each instrument and what is playable or not. But beyond that, here too there are important psychological principles behind the rules. The most important of these principles is the way perception divides up the world into foreground and background. The composer needs to know what will blend with what so as to be able to set up coherent planes of tone. And then, how do we separate planes of tone? If you're accompanying a low clarinet solo with sustained loud trombones, it'll simply be inaudible. Music, unlike speech, can be polyphonic. But musical polyphony is not a democracy. Not all instruments are equal in all registers. Richness of texture comes from multiple planes of tone that are coherently organized. Poorly differentiated planes of tone are just gray or incoherent. Similarly, contrast effects are fundamental to good orchestration. It's impossible to do a good orchestration of any length without saving some things for key moments. If something's there all the time, it will never sound special. Finally, composition is where it all comes together. A good composition teacher will be able to make useful suggestions based on these general principles in whatever style the student is interested in, while at the same time explaining the general principles of musical form. I will cover some of these in the next video of my series. One last point. It's not the teacher's job to dictate style. The real goal, over time, should be to give the student the tools to make good music with a personal voice. And your voice is really just a combination of your own preferences and all the musical dimensions: melody, harmony, rhythm, texture, orchestration, and so on. The details of the principles named should become internal checkpoints for you as you compose, things to look out for in whatever style you're working in.